See,
that
that's
in there.
another episode we should do in a year or so. It's like undone curved moments that we
Yeah,
collectively come up with.
moments that you wanted to act like an asshole and were and social graces and
And
norms prohibited you from doing.
and what does it all say about neoliberalism?
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Bunga Bunga, the global politics podcast at the end of history. My name is Alex Hochuli. It's Tuesday, the 12th of October, but you're hearing this at the beginning of November, I think. I'm joined, as usual, by George Hoare. Hi, George.
Hi, Alex. How are you doing?
Good. That was your cue to come in right there. But anyway, that's fine.
I nailed it.
You nailed it.
Absolutely nailed it.
And Phil Cunliffe is feeling a bit under the weather, so he's away. But in his place, we have an upgrade in the form of satirical architect or architectural satirist, Karl Sharro, also known as Karl Remarks on Twitter. Hi, Karl.
Hi, Alex. Hi, George. Great to be with you again.
Yeah, very good. Very good. We were actually trying to remember when the last time you were on. And actually, I think it was May 2018 when we were talking about the World Cup. So it's been a long time and you should have been on sooner than this, but excited to have you on today to talk about your essay, The Retreat from Universalism in the Middle East and the World, which is a report for the Century Foundation, which came out in 2019. But Karl pointed it my way only recently. And I realized, well, we have to get him on to talk about it because obviously, regular listeners on the podcast will know that we have an ongoing concern on the podcast with defending secular universalism. And that's whether it's challenging identity politics in the West and their narcissistic particularism, or challenging sectarianism and religious and ethnic nationalism elsewhere in the world. And of course, it's 2021, so it's been a decade since the Arab Spring, and that region in particular is still living in the shadow of that failure. So this is all useful background before I bring Karl in. Just one quick thing before that, which is I wanted to highlight two relatively recent episodes which we've had, which act as, I think, useful companion pieces for what's about to come. So we have episode 198, Universal India with Achin Van Eyck, which covers these debates about secularism and universalism, specifically in the Indian context, but which have much wider importance and relevance. And of course, episode 141, O Lebanon, What Now, with Rima Majed, someone who actually Karl put us in touch with, who was an excellent guest, talking about the crisis in Lebanon, talking about the confessional system there. And Karl today, I guess, is going to talk to us about the Lebanonization of the world. I don't know if that's the term that he'd want to use. Maybe I'm putting words into his mouth. But anyway, that maybe just gives you a sense of what it's about.
Are you doing a franchise, Alex?
That's right.
Off your article and your book here.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, we're gonna talk maybe towards the end about whether it's Brazilianization or Lebanonization, or if you have other suggestions. Japan. I think someone suggested Japanization. We talked once about that on the podcast. So
what about Angloization? English.
That's what's happened. I mean, that already was a phase in world history, and we're leaving that behind.
George, it's called colonialism. We'll talk about it one day.
Okay. Well, mate. Okay. Well, at least we had our time in the sun. Made the most of it.
So, first of all, I guess, Karl, what was the context of you deciding to write this? It obviously starts off kind of with talking about the effect of Islamic State on the region, the Middle East, and on communal relations. It's kind of wider impact. So I guess the obvious question, what prompted you to write it?
The kind of the practical context was that the Century Foundation and a couple of my friends who were there at the time came up with this idea for a project that had about 25 different participants to address the notion of religion, the role of religion in politics in the Middle East, and looking at alternatives for that. And it was quite a diverse group of people writing from different angles. And it was quite an interesting format because we took a long time in terms of kind of having these discussions, trying to draw out themes across the board and for everyone to go and find their own angle to jump into it. Now, for people who had been reading my stuff, prior to that, the 10 years before, the 10 people who have been reading my stuff would know that kind of obsession with the similarities.
Karl, you have at least 11 Twitter followers. It's certainly more than 10.
Okay, fair point. And my serious stuff. So they'll know that I've been kind of harping on about this kind of I don't want to kind of make a lot out of it, but this kind of superficial resemblance between multicultural arrangements in the West, particularly in Britain, and the Lebanese system, and we'll come on to what those similarities are, and I thought it was an opportunity to sort of draw on those topics, but try to answer a very topical question at that moment, because something big had really happened, right? So the rise and then subsequent defeat of ISIS, which was quite a major catastrophic thing. And it's almost like passed afterwards as if it was, a summer's cloud, and there wasn't any willingness to really grapple with it, try to understand what made that happen. How can you go very quickly within what was termed the Arab Spring, from these kind of demands for freedom and equality and getting rid of dictators to something very ugly and something quite vicious like Islamic State, and kind of trying to understand really what happened and what that represents for the future of post-identity-based movements within the region. So there are all these kind of questions in the background, and we can come back and break them down to make it more tangible. And I sort of wanted to address that head on, and I wanted to address it in a kind of quite meta way, in a kind of attempting to grapple with it on a quite a kind of comprehensive level, rather than take a very niche approach. And
it definitely does that. But I think it's interesting. I mean, just to jump in, the way in which I think people have tried to forget about Islamic State, I think is kind of remarkable, because it was like, well, this thing came up, it was messy and extremely ugly, and now it's gone, and now we can forget about that and kind of get on with the rest of our lives. But it's certainly in the region, kind of like as if that's now been completely bookended and won't have any lasting effects. And I think you do highlight the way that that it's something that can't just be, you can't just wash your hands of it, or you can't just forget that it actually happened.
Absolutely. And there were, it's kind of, if you look, I mean, obviously we shouldn't do spurious comparisons, and it wasn't World War II or whatever, but you have a serious attempt at an organized genocide, at least against one group, the Yazidis, and then quite a barbaric acts of violence against other groups, and quite a kind of catastrophic event or sequence of events. And it's sort of, everybody just wants to kind of quickly forget about that and move on. And nowadays, if you actually hear about it, you hear about it through the plight of the people who went to join ISIS from Germany or Denmark or whatever. Like, they've become the victims somehow in this equation, or Shumayma Begum or whatever. And there's very little discussion of the rest of the kind of the story. So I wanted to be, at the heart of that, in saying, no, this is not something that can be dismissed quite easily. We can't have very easy answers as well for it. We have to actually start addressing some serious questions. And this thing wasn't just born out of nothing. And we really need to understand what brought us here. And also, what's the path for the future that we can start to explore a different form of politics that ultimately will prevent this thing from happening again. So that was kind of the premise. I know it was kind of a really overambitious, and I absolutely failed in it, but it was worth a shot, I guess. So that was the context.
Well, I mean, only if the ambition was to bring back secularism to the Middle East single-handedly. No, I think you didn't quite manage that. But the essay is fantastic, and I encourage people to read it.
Yeah, I mean, I should ask a question that Phil, if he wasn't ill, Phil, today would ask, which is about ISIS specifically. I mean, is there a way that ISIS was actually quite a universalistic project? It was quite cosmopolitan, looking to transcend some kind of archaic national state boundaries and actually appeal to a cosmopolitan idea, in the sense of having a community that's supranational, You could call it a cosmopolitan dystopian project. But is this the sort of universalism that you're talking about, or that you're particularly interested in this essay? I mean, I should probably clarify to listeners that I mean, I think if you're reading this essay of Karl's as a defense of ISIS, then probably there's a bit of a problem with your comprehension skills. But yeah, what do you think?
No, I think that's a great observation, and it actually draws upon certain themes within Islam that lay claim to a certain form of universality, right? So you get, some pronouncements about equality between the races, that they're all equal in front of the God, or the different tribes, or things like that. And that's kind of quite important, but also I think it was quite important historically within Islam in allowing it to expand quite quickly. I mean, it's something that I cover in another essay, ironically, about architecture, which is called In Defense of Islamic Architecture, whereas there's a kind of an alternative form of universalism embodied within Islam. And it's a form of universalism that only allowed to operate within the kind of the confines of what Islam deems acceptable. And within that, some other groups are tolerated. We're talking about, the earlier periods of Islamic civilization, and there's certain rule for integrating them within society. So that does have universalistic aspirations. ISIS is obviously not necessarily representative, although it's a little bit of a cliche. It's not a representative of Islam. Nothing could be. It's representative of certain strands that are very contemporary, that emerge out of Islamic societies. And therefore, it embodies that notion, which you get people from all over the world speaking different languages. We've all heard the stories where some of them have never read the Quran. They couldn't speak Arabic, but they were kind of drawn by something. Right. And obviously that's quite distinct from a universalism that's much more encompassing, that essentially what we want from it, people like me, what they want out of it is a different form of politics that is more interested in class, is more interested in class interest, is more interested in a secular form of politics. So that obviously is not tolerated under the vision, but it does have that kind of in a kind of inversion of the way it's organized is kind of became a claimant to a form of universalization. Now this is not exactly our topic, but I think what ultimately defeated it partially from within is the other layer on top of it, which was this kind of I was going to say millenarian.
You can't blame the millennials for everything.
You can't blame the millennials for everything, yeah. And that kind of was self-exhausting, right? Like even after it acquires territory and things like that, it's incapable intellectually and conceptually from kind of holding onto that territory or forming a project of power that will allow it to sustain itself, right? So it's a self-consuming millenarian form of that universalism. Is driven by a cultish end of days project that's going to consume itself, which in my opinion then it kind of undermines that whole point of the universalism, because it's non-durable. And even at the level of trying to make an appeal to within Islamic society, or whatever one you call it, to be the kind of the supreme arbiter of truth, of that, it ultimately failed even in that, right? Yeah. So I think that's the...
Yeah, and I think, the primary target of your essay is sectarianism. And I think you suggest in the thing that the effect of ISIS, despite its sort of somewhat of its universalist slant, is that it ultimately ends up being a kind of Sunni sectarianism, or perhaps even more narrow than that. And not only that, but then provokes other forms of sectarianism in response to it and in defense against it. So you talk about kind of defense brigades being created by whatever the Yazidis to defend themselves against Islamic State. So whatever its universalistic pretensions, it ends up being quite sectarianism. Is that right?
Yeah, no, of course. So what we're saying about the universalism is defined not even within the confines of Islam itself, but even from a very narrow Sunni supremacist position, right?
Yeah.
That is the message. I mean, what makes it distinct from other, let's say, supremacist movements that are more race-based or things like that is obviously they wouldn't be open to other ethnicities or creeds or races or things like that. I think where it was kind of a little bit more complex and problematic in this sense is behind this Sunni supremacist view. There's a kind of a universalism in a very, very narrow sense.
Yeah, and
In
I guess
it's in its kind of global appeal. Yeah,
I guess it's sort of cosmopolitanist or globalist, but not necessarily. It's certainly not universalist, and actually, kind of, I guess what's distinct about it is that it's not localist in any way. It's not rooted in any kind of sovereign notion of place and of a certain community, that it can be open to everyone, but still extremely sectarian. With that in mind, I'm going to just sort of make a bridge to Lebanon, which I guess, in light of the experience of Islamic State, some have held up as a potential model for the Middle East. And anybody who knows anything about Lebanon, I think, would probably be, well, maybe not everyone, but many people might be taken aback by that idea. And certainly listeners of this podcast, of that episode, which I mentioned at the top on Lebanon, would certainly be taken aback with the idea that Lebanon could some way present a model for peaceful coexistence. So how is it, who's making these arguments, and what sort of arguments are they making for Lebanon somehow being a model for the Middle East?
Well, this is precisely the nub of what I was trying to kind of wrestle with, right, in this essay, but trying to draw out the historic roots of this kind of what we term sectarianism, and what then starts to resemble a multicultural model in the West, and it often gets celebrated in Lebanon as a model of coexistence, right? That superficially, at least, you can get all these different sects, you get some different ethnicities as well, and they can all for certain periods coexist and be happy, and it could be a kind of a functioning, thriving society, and then occasionally it goes into crises. All right, so that what gets celebrated by in my mind, this kind of point of view that wants to celebrate differences, and not only kind of celebrate them but use them as a formalized form of organizing politics and society, right? By which I mean, you don't happen to be of a different religion or sect and you get accepted in that society. Every single way in which that society is organized, from the number of MPs and their allocation across the sets to the number of government employees, to all sorts of kind of quotas, and the way contestation over politics happens, passes through this prism of this organized form of communitarianism. All right.
Yeah.
And that's kind of, to summarize, a very complex argument. And I think listeners can go back to the episode with Rima for a much more kind of lengthy explanation of that, because that's not what we're trying to do here. But we're just saying we're talking about a set of formalized relationships that are given constitutional weight within the way you organize society. And then the observation for me that I think critical to this discussion is there's something, at least superficially, similar that's happening in the West, happening in places like Britain and Canada and America, where you start to shift from this kind of the secular subject, the kind of the notions of universalisms around which countries like France and the United States allegedly were built, to kind of a more fragmented system that kind of wants to make more of these differences and institutionalize the way they are, their relationship to the state and to power is organized. Okay, so that was the observation. Now, when people start to, sorry, George, go ahead.
No. I interrupted you in your flow there. I do have a question, but I'll let you wrap up this point before.
Yeah. So it's kind of quite complex, but I'm trying to make it compressed. Now, the people that celebrate that particular Lebanese model, where I think the issue is, and we can elaborate on it, is they think it's kind of by celebrating those differences and instituting these kind of different allocations for different groups and orchestrating their relationship with each other, that they are presenting an alternative to the supremacist sectarian ISIS model, right? They are not presenting a truly universal model that's based on citizenship, based on equality under the law. They're saying that's the best we can do. That's the right way to counteract that, right? And then my problem with this is that those draw their impulses, what your politics should be, from very simple, similar places. They are about politics being about your identity, who you are by birth, how you organize as a group to protect your interest. Of course, they do it in completely different ways. But nevertheless, the experience of Lebanon shows that that model is prone to chronic crises and kind of constituting a political entity around those fragmentary kind of impulses will invariably lead to periodic explosions. That's the kind of the nub of it.
Yeah, I think.
Go ahead,
I think
George.
it is. Yeah, I think so. When you sort of say that that Lebanon in this case, or in this sense, represents like it's a precursor to multicultural politics in the West.
Absolutely.
And so I guess, yeah. So one of the things that you point to in the essay is that you arrived in Britain in 2002, and there was a lot of talk at this point about Britain being a community of communities. So as much as I would, in fact, I would kind of like to hear your observations on those crazy Brits that you encountered. But like, just to draw that out a little bit more, how did that similarity kind of strike you? How did you start to realize that the multicultural politics in the West around this time were just a kind of an echo of the Lebanese model?
Yeah, and I think that was like a kind of a very kind of alarming observation, but a very interesting observation, because when you're in Lebanon and when we organize politically, particularly in left-wing circles, there's still this ideal of a kind of a secular universalist belonging to something that, there are all kinds of movement from civil marriage isn't allowed. And then, there were movement to kind of try to obtain that, then being able to remove your religion and sect from your identity card. Because the aspiration was kind of, if you overcome these sectarian issues, then we're all kind of, somehow magically attain a different class-based politics, and then you always think that going to the West and countries like Britain and France, then it's going to be this wild celebration of in the one laïcité, but in Britain, it's going to be much more universalist, and there's a very strong left-wing tradition as well as a very strong right-wing tradition, but it will be driven by interest and class interest, and there's these competing visions. And then I come here, and then you see how the institutionalization of the same kind of discourse of, how it's almost like the state becomes an arbiter between different identity groups, all right? To the extent, and Blair was prime minister at the time, and there was talk always of, how do we talk to community leaders? And if there's one particular issue, then that's not dealt through the formal institutions or MPs or like that. The PM or someone might go and talk to a community leader and things like that. And it was superficially then very similar to how we go around solving issues in Lebanon. And then the more I delved into it, and Kenan Malik's work in particular, in kind of examining how the municipal version of these kind of multicultural politics kind of leads to the perpetuation or the production of forms of politics that are, as he described it, is like multiculturalism becomes, the problem and the solution at the same time. So you have diverse societies. The only way to solve it is by addressing those diversities separately, so to speak, rather than trying to seek any form of universal form of addressing that. So that was the observation. And that's what I tried to kind of draw on this and say, is there something much more global, globally operating a cultural transformation that's feeding all these different manifestations in the Middle East and the West? And are there commonalities there that we can learn something from?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's striking that, in hearing you talk about this and having thought about it as well, is that the drive and impulse behind it is one of managing conflict, but keeping everyone in their little boxes without ever really having the possibility of transcending it. And there's an element, I think, certainly in the Middle East, of looking to the Lebanese case of going, hey, this is, okay, they had a whole civil war, but okay, things are a little bit more stable and locked in place there, and that's the best we can hope for.
Well, you have to manage the conflict because it's unresolvable, right? That it's grounded in kind of, I think that's like the explanation. It's grounded in cultural differences and historical differences, and it's not resolvable in the way that class interests are resolvable. There is at least one way you can have a different sort of society that doesn't have those conflicts. But I think I would say that's at least in the British case, that's where the idea of managing conflict comes from, that you can't transcend it because there's no historical drive to transcend like a culture or an ethnicity or anything like that. It's like, these things are given, and you have to respond to them, and you have to be pragmatic and have the best kind of form of dealing with it that you can.
But isn't the point exactly that it's, it serves elite interests quite well to have society divided vertically rather than horizontally, so that you can't have class-based solidarities, and that everyone is, you belong to your tribal leader, and I would say that in kind of scare quotes, obviously. But every citizen belongs to their tribal leader, who acts as an intermediary, an interface between the citizen and the state, and therefore everything keeps kind of locked away, and without any possibility of any real kind of fluidity amongst people and ability to create new masses, basically.
Yeah,
precisely. Yeah. Sorry, George, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say Tony Blair was a very successful tribal leader in this context. Not to steal a joke style of Karl's, but yeah, sorry, you're going to probably say something a bit more more useful to that.
Well, you made me self-conscious now, but I'm joking. You didn't. No, what I was going to say is that's precisely the point, is that does serve elite interest, but also that observation prompts two things. Is one, not to accept this as a modern form of primordial relationships and social formations, right? You have to understand it as a form of modern politics. One, very important. I'm not going to expand on this now. I'll come back to it. But from a point of view of left-wing politics, let's say, you have to do that demystification of this. These are not inherently kind of medieval relationship or feudal relationships that are reproducing themselves in a new form. No, they are new relationship produced precisely for the service of a particular form of state and particular form of capitalism through a certain stage of its evolution within that context. Secondly, the fact that this is replicated in Britain or done in a similar form in Britain is no surprise, because as I say in the essay, the roots of actually these kind of arrangements, by which I mean these formalized communitarian political and social arrangements, come from Britain and France under colonialism, from Britain and India. So they are the ones that start to create quotas for political representation. They are the ones, that all kind of notion of divide and conquer, which might seem a little bit kind of simplistic and cynical, but ultimately there were drivers behind it that, if we just applied normal voting, everyone might be a Hindu, and then we won't have women, we won't have Muslims. Let's orchestrate this. And then maybe that's not a surprise in the case of Britain, but then you look at what France did in some of its colonies, where on the one hand, in France, it's celebrating laïcité and, all those notions that the French state is built around. But when you go to the colonies, then they come to Lebanon and create something quite different, right? And they create something much more communitarian, and they create an entire political system that's organized about this, which is distinctly different from what happens in France, right? And there's no surprise there, because the relationship was a relationship between center and periphery, under a colonized kind of perception of the world, and then what was seen as good enough for the French wasn't seen as good enough for those backward peripheral colonized subjects. So I think those are really two key important aspects to bear in mind.
Yeah, and that point that you make at the end is something that the intellectual critics of universalism seize on as a way to undermine universalism and to point out the hypocrisy there, saying, well, the French aren't consistent implementers of it. And you put it quite well that you say that is based on a simplified linear model of development of the West, that they've understood Western universalism to have come about almost as a sort of automatic process of capitalist development and economic modernization rather than as the result of actual social struggle.
Absolutely. Which is kind of like it's a gotcha. It's like the worst gotcha in the world that a lot of post-colonialists in particular try to trip you up on it as a kind of universalist, where they say, oh, look, they were being hypocritical. And I'm like, well, of course we know that they're being hypocritical because they were colonizers to start with. And that's got nothing to do with, the logic of the Enlightenment or...
Did you know they were actually racist? Like, yes, that is a major part of the story.
We're quite aware of that. Exactly. So it's like the worst gotcha in the world. But also it's, again, this oversimplified model that assumes of understanding the West. And this is Vivek Shibber in particular does a beautiful job of kind of dismantling. I mean, he actually dismantles an entire school of thought, but in particular dismantles this kind of a misunderstanding of the way Western society is developed by post-colonialists, where it almost assumes there is no bottom-up push, there are no social struggles, there are no workers' rights or women's rights or things like that have been obtained from below. These have all been handed out by enlightened liberal elites, which is, of course, I mean,
and then obviously they were hypocritical. Yeah, like obviously, so if it was handed out by them, they might do it unequally. Yeah,
exactly.
You also point in the essay to CLR James's point in Black Jacobins that, like, the French were really hypocritical in their kind of instantiation of some of their own revolutionary ideas, and it took precisely the Black Jacobins to show them what these ideas really meant. And there's no kind of contradiction in that. It's just you can't expect that the historical group of like 18th century French people to get to that point.
French colonizers in particular, right? Because I mean, you're looking at a society in which there's all sorts of, there's strong left-wing movements, all of that, but it wasn't them that was going around colonizing the world, and hence this inability to see these complexities within colonizing societies, these kind of social struggles within the West, and it's all kind of leading to this construction of racialized and nationalized identities that ultimately drives towards one thing, that the way you understand Western society and its evolution under capitalism is fundamentally, what post-colonialists argue, is inapplicable in the East, because the oversimplification that follows is these people are much more interested in a traditional relationship like kin and religion and things like that, and they're inevitably going to follow a different path of development, blah, blah, so on and so forth, not to sound a bit Zizekian now. And that's that's the kind of, so it's almost like a transference, because in their failure to explain this, mystifying failure of, let's say, elites in India to kind of transition India to a high form of modernity and things like that, they fall back onto archetypes and a kind of an oversimplification of their own societies and what matters in those societies.
Yeah, and for all that they pretend to speak for those, from below or whatever, to have some sort of plebeian pretensions, that whole analysis bears witness to the failure, or rather the absence, of a class analysis right from the start, that they look at the West and they don't see they don't see the class tensions that have led to these to the kind of universalism and the even the institutionalization of certain universalism in the form of citizenship. So I mean, it's remarkable how that anybody could mistake this for anything that could be vaguely left wing. That said, and I want to move on to talk about specifically the Middle East, because it's obvious, and I think you say this in maybe not in so many words, but that the sheen has come off of secularism. Of course, not just in the Middle East, but sticking to the Middle East specifically. Authoritarian, modernizing, and ostensibly secular regimes in Syria and Egypt in particular seem to have been complicit with that undermining of secularism. Can you talk us through that? Like, what role have they played, and what do you think, maybe popularly across the region, that I suppose negative example, what role that negative example has played for people in maybe making secularism seem less appealing?
Yeah, so it operates on a couple of different levels. One is there is no notion of a secularism devoid of a particular political project that gives its meaning and form. Right?
Yeah.
It doesn't exist in the abstract. So you might have secularism under a communist project will look different to what it might look like under a liberal project, to what it might look like under an authoritarian project, which is what you end up with in the aftermath of national liberation movements. And the only way that those elites that were largely drawn from the army across places like Iraq, Syria, Egypt, it kind of evolved into this authoritarian form, and it varies in the way it operates from different contexts, but it came a handy way of saying, in Egypt we've got a significant Christian minority, and the state will start to represent itself in varying degrees as a kind of, particularly in the last 10 years, as kind of representing something that's quite distinct from the divisive Muslim Brotherhood, let's say, approach, right? Yeah. Or more traditionally in Iraq and Syria, where talking about secularism, the way the kind of the state imposed secularism is the way of overcoming this cliche that's always used. These are societies that are mosaics of ethnicities and sects. And in both instances, although in one of them, secularism was kind of used as a vehicle to mask the control of small sectarian groups that controlled power. For example, in Iraq and Syria, to mask their kind of sectarian identity, right? So there's a high secularist discourse that kind of says, let's kind of not ask people what the sect is, because it will become quite apparent that this state or that state is controlled by a majority of people from a particular sect. Yeah. And then it operates differently. Obviously, we always have to be careful about this and not do generalizations. It operates differently. And none of them might ever kind of talk about it in a very over-enthusiastic way where we're secularists or whatever. But there's insinuations, there's way in which the state represents itself that kind of seems to be aspiring to represent itself as a secular model. Right. Now, what happens as a result of that then is many people who are oppressed or put in jail or whatever because they belong to a particular religion or sect, and kind of their issue becomes, and again you go back, for example, to the example of the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria or in Egypt, then they start to see this state as illegitimate. Firstly, it's illegitimate because it doesn't represent a true form of Islamic governance in their eyes, but also because it's persecuting them for who they are, right? And there's a kind of a complex number of developments over decades where that kind of notion of secularism as some sort of panacea for the ills of divided societies or fragmented societies or multi-ethnic, multi-sectarian societies starts to lose its sheen, because you can see that the only people talking about secularism are the authoritarians, right?
Yeah.
And that is a failure, in particular, of left-wing movements to claim the mantle of secularism. And
why did they not want that mantle? Like, what's wrong, or what's kind of like I don't know, dangerous or kind of strategically not very useful about specifically advocating secularism? I guess there's a question like what do you mean by secularism? But like, why is it that those movements kind of step away from it or don't feel like it's the right thing to do?
That's a really good question, and particularly among the communists, there's when you read through the literature, you feel that in a lot of the instances, in my personal opinion, it's an act of political cowardice, right? And they always felt like they had to kind of tiptoe very carefully around the subject of religion, not to kind of undermine themselves against. In a lot of the writing, you see that they felt that societies weren't quite ready, right? And in classic communist terms, they're like, we have to wait, as if you're cooking, you have to wait for society to be. I mean, there's objective conditions and all of that. But
was it a sort of Stalinist? Sorry, was it a sort of Stalinist kind of notion of stages?
Yes,
that was behind
that? Precisely. And I'm coming next to the next point is the other thing that hurt communist Arab parties in particular was their close relationship with the Soviet Union, and then a number of kind of instances in which, for example, Soviet Union supported the creation of Israel in 1948. It had a number of other issues before where, in Stalin's policies where there were things that were perceived that they would harm the image of communist parties if they then came across as rabid Jacobinites that are going to destroy churches and mosques and do things like that, right? So in my view, it's primarily political cowardice, and there are several kind of degrees of political cowardice that led to the ultimate defeat of communists in places like Iraq against weaker opponents, but that's not what we're talking about today. But political cowardice was central to it, and the other one was this kind of relationship with Stalinist Russia, and the fact that they were always perceived as being kind of a little bit out of place, not having enough of a foothold, and kind of trying to tiptoe around the subject of religion just to kind of get a certain level of acceptance. All right, so it's not very kind of high conceptual stuff. It was more tactical, immediate kind of concerns, but you never then arrived at that point where like a true Jacobite manifestation of what those communist movements might have been like. So as a result of that, then we get to the point where the only form of secularism you're experiencing as a citizen in this country is the official secularism that comes from authoritarian states. And that is, by 2011, is completely discredited.
Yeah, and not by chance the Arab Spring explodes in precisely those states and not, for example, in the monarchies, generally speaking.
Exactly. And that's a really great observation because, again, and I think it's a side issue here, but the monarchies have managed for different reasons to kind of sidestep these issues. And they didn't have the same kind of polities that presented these in these ways. They've never specifically went about and talked about secularism and things like that. And they also drew their political legitimacy to a certain extent from religion, and so it was an entirely different balance. The problem is primarily the problem of Arab republics or Middle Eastern North African republics, and that is where you see these manifestations.
So that's really interesting. I want to come back to that in just a second because there's a question, maybe a broader question, which we want to go on to discuss about the end of modernization in maybe broader terms than just the question of secularism. But just to kind of round off the question of secularism, what is the debate right now in the Middle East? Because, of course, as you said, secularism always takes a determinate form. It's always tied to a particular political project. It's not just an abstract sort of identikit model. And there's many kind of different meanings behind it. So just to spell out kind of three possibilities, and if you could tell us what you think is the most popular or most commonly held notion of secularism there. Because I mean, there's one which is the weakest form, which is, I guess, what you get in the United States, which is that the state is equidistant from different religions. The state doesn't favor one religion or one sector over the other, but it recognizes them all. So there's an official state recognition often of religion. Then there's the stricter separation of church and state. And then the third level, which is the strongest form of secularism, would be a French-style laïcité, and which also implies a certain idea or a certain telos about the way society is going, that the state will play, or society will play, a role in making itself more secular, which is to say less religious. And what is the debate about secularism in the Middle East now? What is it mainly, or maybe in Lebanon specifically? Which one of these does it have in mind?
So I was going to precisely answer by saying it varies according to context, because it always has a political use for why you are suggesting it, right? The most obvious example is Lebanon, when you're precisely talking about these vertical divisions, and secularism is the means to an end towards trying to erode or undermine these vertical divisions in society, okay? But you have to see it as in a different context, because as a Lebanese citizen, you'll have that identity on your national identity card. You'll have that sect. You will get employment, go to a particular university sometimes, vote for a certain MP, all those based on that, right?
Yeah.
So in that context, is seen as a way, as an ideal that replaces this divisive political entity and does away with the vertical division of society. You go to Iraq, particularly with the demonstration in the last few years, where because the Lebanese model was kind of replicated there in political representation and in the way the power structures are organized, you start to see kind of a semblance of that emerging as well, where the calls for secularism are demands for kind of doing away with these vertical separations within society. You go to other contexts, it becomes software. It's no longer called al-almaniya, secularism. It's called the civic state, right? So you want a state that a little bit, it's again, it's not kind of built around this maybe the role of religion within public life. Maybe in a lot of the countries, for example, you'll see something that says the Quran is the first source of legislation in the constitution, is trying to move away from that. So it will always be manifested not in an idealized form, which it shouldn't obviously, but in how it serves a political purpose. And that political purpose isn't always a specific political project, but a yearning for a different form of political arena in which this political project can emerge, if that makes sense.
So it's seen as a precursor, or the platform on which the politics could be played out. Yeah. No,
precisely. The idea is if you move beyond that, then people will then kind of reprogram to think more of their interests rather than through these vertical subdivisions of society.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. And yeah, the way that it would play out differently in different places, and Lebanon specifically as a way of getting past the vertical division. And I guess in other places it might have a certain vision about republicanism, maybe perhaps, which is a term that we haven't used so far. I'm saying this as a way of getting to the next point I wanted to discuss, which is the end of modernization. And it's something that I've written about separately, and which encompasses a whole range of different phenomena today, which include the end of universalism, the end of secularism, maybe even the end of republicanism that we've been discussing here, but also involves the end of formal work, the end of citizenship, the end of social democracy, et cetera, right? So there's all these different things that you could bring together. What I want to discuss and bring forward in this discussion specifically about the Middle East is that it seems that in that context, you have what you've already describing, Karl, about the decrepit nature of authoritarian regimes who wielded secularism in kind of hypocritical and authoritarian and oppressive forms. And you have the monarchies, which then weren't shaken by the Arab Spring. And then probably you have the only vision of modernity, and it's a very thin one, in the region presented by the Gulf states. And so where is there a vision of modernization, I guess, in the Middle East today, and what are its components? Because all, as I said, all that you have is the specific vision of kind of glass towers and shopping malls and near slave labor in the form of the Gulf states.
Yeah, well, but it is a vision of modernization because, it's about, if you look at all the slogans, these are sold, and, you just look at the practical results of it. If you're a Lebanese citizen who lives in Lebanon, you can't get medicine, there's no electricity, the roads are all, you can't drive on them. And then you go to a place like the UAE, where, the electricity is reliable, there's public transport, the roads are great, and there's development, you see development around. So I think it's done through this vehicle of development particular, and that development takes a concrete shape, excuse the pun, like literally a concrete shape through, buildings and bridges and roads and investment in infrastructure. And that was always part of what the promise of modernization is, because it represents a solution to your problems in life. It represents an aspirational aspect for your life, a better way for you to take control of resources of your country, find jobs, hospitalization, education. You need to build schools, build universities. So that exists in that form. Now, the way the Gulf states talk about it is they like to separate, which is not unlike European elites in different stages of capitalism, to separate the democratization process from the developmental process.
Yeah.
All right. So it's like we're different societies. So they're culturally relativistic in that sense, but they're not doing anything or saying anything that post-colonialists are not saying. They're saying because we have a cultural specificity, maybe representational democracy in the form that is known in the West is not right for us. Again, it's something that a lot of people seemingly on the left say all the time, but we've got the developmental aspect figured, right? That problem that for a lot of other nations they can't even begin to grapple with. We have the infrastructure, we have the electricity, we have all that kind of thing. So that's kind of the tool of legitimization that is in effect, if it wasn't working, it would form a political crisis, right?
So it's kind of a mixed bag. Like democracy is not right, but on the other hand, like development is suitable, and we can we can put up these buildings, and that's what's appropriate at this point.
Yeah, I mean, they're very explicit about it, and you can see from their point why they would say it and why they would point to successes in it, right? So when you look at a country that has, like the UAE, that has very fast growing cities, that draws millions of people from around the world and in the region in particular, they are able to point to a material success that other nations cannot actually point to, right? And that kind of forms a fissure in this, because you used to think of all of these things on one package, right? That it's a process of democratization and modernization and social development and things like that.
Yeah.
What they've kind of very cleverly latched on is there's a fissure there, but it's a fissure that there's no one in the world, hardly anyone in the world now today saying doesn't exist. Because as I keep saying, you have people on the left, seemingly on the left today, saying things like, maybe Western democracy, isn't right for Western style democracy. It's always called that, is not right for our societies because we care about different things. And again, to go back to some post-colonialists who will make these points, right? So all of a sudden you see this kind of seemingly should be like opposing camps agreeing on a very fundamental thing. And this is what I was trying to point to in the essay, that there are very fundamental assumptions about the way we understand these processes. Once you kind of overcome this notion of universalism and things like that, that then you can become much more relativistic about it. You can become much more cherry picking about it. And then these processes of legitimization of power then start to draw on those. And that's precisely what you see in places like the Gulf.
Yeah, no, I guess that makes a lot of sense. I guess that also would apply. I mean, that universalism can be used, I think, and you kind of use it as well as quite a useful battering ram around to kind of capture a whole range of different tensions and conflicts and antagonisms, even in relation to for example, mass inclusion and kind of in an economic sense. Because I think that when we were in London in the pub, we were talking and you were telling me about Saudi Arabia and that actually the degrees of poverty there as well. And so that would be another way in which I guess some vision of modernization, of a kind of universal modernization, is also not being realized, even in somewhere like Saudi Arabia, which has, growth rates, new cities, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, it's particularly a problem of unemployment. That is correct. And it takes a form of, like any kind of society in those things, it takes a form of uneven development. Obviously, these problems will reproduce themselves over there. Saudi Arabia is unique in a sense, though, because it's the largest and it has a big population, and it's again having to find itself. So in a sense, it's kind of the only one of the Gulf states that of that scale, that it faces this problem and has historically looked for different ways in solving these problems. But ultimately, the solution for that is problems of uneven development and things like that. That's a material solution in a way. The political vehicles that will deliver it will differ, but that's what you see now. Saudi Arabia has this kind of the 2030 vision. We're going to build that many houses, we're going to build that many schools. So they're actually suggesting a kind of a material solution for that, right? And that's how they're going about it. And even within the confines of that, that's something that you don't necessarily find in other places in the Middle East. And here I want to draw your attention to something, a very interesting phenomenon that happens in Lebanon, for example, because the elite seemingly there, the ruling elite, will say, we want to build big projects. Who stops the big projects? It's the activists and, civil society and the opposition groups, the young opposition groups, right? They have this aversion to large infrastructure projects. Now, put this in the context of a country that has chronic shortages of electricity, water, all kinds of resources, and they're kind of viscerally opposed to any large infrastructure project to solve that, right? And that's, again, another, we're talking about people that are largely Western trained or educated, or, trained in Lebanon, educated in Lebanon in Westernized institutions, and they absorbed all this kind of, let's call it the post-material construct, right? It's a little bit, a lot of environmentalist influences on it, a lot of kind of small is beautiful, that kind of impulse. Big infrastructure projects are bad socially, are bad, all this kind of logic, right? So when you kind of compare the two entities, it's kind of an inversion of what you haven't imagined historically, because you would have had the left-wing groups, for example, in Arab republics, they would have historically said, we need big investment infrastructure, we need dams, we need to take control of our own energy, we need to build, we need to develop, and then the ruling elites weren't able to do that. And then you get to an inversion of that in Lebanon now. Now, as it happens, the Lebanese ruling elite is utterly hopeless and they can't build themselves out of a shoebox. But at least rhetorically, right, they're saying, we want to build these big projects, which are corrupt, which they're going to get a big cut out of whatever. But at least they're kind of claiming that this is the solution. And here, the opposition comes from a different part, right? So what does that point to bring it back to our story? What we're trying to do is there is a crisis of what modernization means, right? Yeah. So there's an attempt at representing, maybe we just want modernization in social relations or modernization of political forms, right?
Yeah, sort of cultural progressivism, for example, or whatever.
Precisely, yeah. But we don't want to pour too much concrete to do that, and we don't want to build a lot of things, and we want to preserve our heritage and we want to preserve the environments and all that kind of thing, right? So you end up in a very weird
and you get the opposite, and you get the opposite, I guess. I mean, the kind of rich Gulf states represent the opposite. We'll pour a lot of concrete, but there's no social
precisely. That's what I'm pointing at. In both contexts, there's a kind of decoupling from how we used to understand modernization. Let's say at the eve of independence, when national liberation movements had achieved independence, the template was much clearer, right? There's a path of material progress that's going to allow us to take control of our own destiny. And with it, it will bring the means and the precursors to social development, economic development, democratization, liberalization, all these kind of things in different forms, right? It was a much clearer kind of template. And then now today you see the decoupling between these different trends and the cherry picking, that we want this bit of it. We want the infrastructure, we don't want the other stuff, or we just want the other stuff, we don't want the infrastructure. And that's at the heart of how we understand modernization itself as a project today.
Yeah, I mean, so when I've talked about the kind of, not so much about the Middle East and some of these sectarian notions, but the failure of modernization, the failure of capitalist modernization, and indeed maybe even the impossibility of it. We've talked about it in terms of Brazilianization. Is there? I don't even know if I should ask this question, but is there a sort of Lebanonization of the world as well, where you can project onto, I mean, obviously abstracting from the specificities of Lebanon, but of a kind of growing sectarianism and a sense of being stuck in a present like that, which is then played out in other countries in the world. I mean, you start off by talked about it today here as well, about the way that, for example, British multiculturalism as a way of managing diversity itself is in some sense looks a little bit like Lebanese sectarianism.
Yeah, you have to make a pitch for Lebanonization to replace Brazilianization as the way to talk about the future.
No, but even this notion of like, yes, we'd like to build things, right? We'd like to have some economic modernization, but we can't. Our hands are tied. I mean, is that a sort of something that you can kind of distill there from the Lebanese experience, or am I just trying to put words in your mouth?
No. I think there's a very valid argument to be there, but I'll explain how I see it. But first of all, just to say, I don't resent the Brazilianization of the word, because obviously Brazil belongs to us, the Lebanese, because there's so many of them over there, right? So that's kind of like a sub branch. You're not amused,
Yeah.
Alex.
No, I'm laughing. I'm laughing. I was just on mute. I'm laughing I'm laughing hard but cynically at that. Yeah.
So where I see
just one famous Lebanese Brazilian politician is known for the slogan "Rouba mais faz." He steals, but he gets things done, and he was quite explicit about the fact that he stole. But he actually pours concrete. He gets things done. So there you go. That's maybe very
no, but that's actually, it's funny enough. That's an old Lebanese thing as well, right? Like particularly at this moment
it's an ancient tribal tradition of Lebanese.
It's an ancient Phoenician saying. It's like basically the
ritual of the concrete pouring.
No, but it was like with the old generations of politicians, like everybody knew that they were stealing and getting their cut, but they were getting something done, right? And the current ones, they just take the cut. They don't build anything, and so do you know the joke, right? I have to tell a joke. I can't be Karl Marx and tell the joke. So it's basically this Lebanese politician goes to visit a French politician in France. And this guy takes him to his villa, nice villa, big villa, and quite a big garden, nice swimming pool. And he says to him, how did you get the money? You're a politician, a politician salary. How did you get the money to build this big villa? And he points to a highway in the distance, and he said, do you see this highway? And he says, yes. He's like, it was supposed to be half the size, and so we only built half, and I took the money, the rest of the money, and built this villa. And he said, okay, that's great. And then so the next month, the French politician goes to visit the Lebanese politician. And then he comes in, and it's not a villa. It's an amazing palace. The swimming pool is twice as large as his. The gardens are fantastic. And he says, wow, how did you manage to build this on a politician's salary? And he says, wait, do you see that highway over there? He said, no, I don't see any highway. And he's like, exactly.
Very good.
Very good.
So I was going to answer the question about where I see this Lebanonization going, and really that's part of what I was driving that in the essay, is basically in this formalization of relationships between the state and identity groups, right? And then the transition from just a recognition to formal representation and establishing formal rules for engaging these identities and giving them a say. So you end up with groups becoming the kind of not individuals becoming the forming entities of any polities, which the extreme of that is obviously Lebanon, because you've got the the sects. And I don't like the term sectarianism, and I'm going to say why, but let's call it sects for now, because that's how the system is organized in that transition. And you see movements that I'm not saying they're going to end up being the same, but you can see the formalization of this relationship, right? And you can see it in things like, for example, where you get a group of people that's being offended, and then something's got to be done about it, something has to be banned, and how the state is more and more stepping in to enable that, and how the state is stepping in to enable that, both through formal and informal mechanisms. For example, as the police in Britain would come and visit you, pay you a visit, and kind of ask you please not to do that, or not to do a certain talk, and things like that, right? So it's not quite formalized, but it's acquiring more and more of a formalized nature. So what I'm saying with this, as the old form of politics are dying, and even with the kind of the most hardcore leftist movement, there's this very strong identitarian impulses, those relationships are inevitably going to be formalized. And these are going to become the fissures within the society, to the detriment of any kind of, in my mind, real left-wing movements that are working for very clear material ends, or economic ends, or social ends, or political ends, whatever it may be. This kind of dilution of that through the identitarian prism is already happening, and that starts to resemble what I call always the kind of the logical end of that kind of organizing your society, which is Lebanon, right? Is every group then becomes a political entity, and it's an identity group, so which means you can't leave it, you can't join it, you can't change your opinion about it, because that's how you are born. And then it starts to spin off other kind of movements. And it represents interesting dilemmas, by the way, because you get, for example, Lebanese activists who would be completely against the system and saying we shouldn't elect people because of their sects and things like that, and we should do away with that political system. And then you go and say, but what about the representation of women in parliament or other groups in parliament? And say, oh, why don't we start a quota for that? Right. Mm-hmm, yeah. So essentially, it's only what they're asking for is now actually they're legitimizing the system. They're just asking for a place within it that recognizes the group that they want to be, which means now we're starting to see this kind of crossbreeding between the old identities, which are the sects, and then the new identities being, I don't know, being LGBT, or being a woman, or being ethnicities that are not already recognized in Lebanon, and things like that, which again, you see then a lot of similarities with what's happening in the West. Now, it's not an inevitable and it's not an exact replication, but we are seeing whole political traditions that are being overhauled, and the alternative is a very fragmentary, divisive, identitarian one, and that is going to constantly push for more recognition and for formal recognition, and ultimately for more constitutional recognition, right? Yeah. And very formalized ways in which it's integrated into the political system of any country, because we're just at the beginning of that, and there is no pushback. The only pushback that you get is a right-wing authoritarian, identitarian impulse, not a universalist secular project, right? Which is like, even, it's much worse. And it's also operating on the same assumptions. So it's definitely not the solution, but that's the only pushback that you're getting. And it's a pushback that only reinforces this, right? And I'll give you an example how that resolves itself in Lebanon, and see if it resembles things that you might recognize in the West. So the way the Lebanese system deals with these kind of irreconcilable differences is you might get something like a billboard for an ad for, I don't know, an IKEA ad, let's say, in which there's a woman in a swimsuit or in her underwear or something, and they say, okay, it's okay to put this ad in a Christian area of Beirut, but when we go to the Muslim area of Beirut, we're going to take the same ad and make the woman, dress the woman in long robes, right? That's how, and it kind of, this is how you kind of accommodate these things, right? And you start to look at the West, and you see, now, especially with we're doing everything digitally, right? And everything can be personalized, but it's personalized not for a person. It's personalized for the consumption of groups that are produced by this form of capitalism.
Everybody's a marketing category, basically.
Exactly. I mean, I don't know if you've seen this thing where Amazon now is you can basically you've got all these stores in Amazon, and so you can shop at like veteran-owned stores, Black-owned stores, Asian-owned stores. So it's like I mean the amazing cynical nature of it is so blatant and people don't see through it, right? It's like, oh no, of course that's encouraging black owned stores, so it's great. Capitalism is
Yeah.
being so magnanimous and sharing the wealth and things like that. And those are kind of tendencies that I'm much more interested in observing, and how these kind of two different contexts can tell us something about the way politics is being shaped and societies are being shaped, and not interdependently. We're all so much more connected now, and these are the things that I think we need to be really paying attention to now, because all the rules are being rewritten.
Absolutely. Yeah. And in a world of low growth and little to go around, every social demand can very usefully be funneled into whatever kind of narrow sectionalist or sectarian interest groups, or interest group based demands, right? So it actually proves quite a useful way to manage social conflict, which is where we started with this discussion in the first place.
Yeah, and that's precisely the point, is not to accept the kind of the mystification of this, right? But to understand that there's a material reality to all of this, and it's about a way of organizing, the hegemony over resources of society and their allocation under, a low growth environment and these kind of things. So it's always important to pay attention to that, because there are always in these situations there are material interests that are masking themselves under those categories, and they might not do it cynically. By the way, they might not do it cynically because
they might
it's
really
an
believe
entire
it.
Yeah, they might believe it because it's an entirely new paradigm. But clearly, I mean, and you can't even blame them in a way, because they're working for their own material self-interest under that very narrow definition, right? It's not one where it seeks to maximize the entire output of a society so that redistribution can become more equitable. It's about carving a bigger share for yourself. It's that interest in that narrow sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's great stuff. I think we might leave this here. Actually, could have carry on about the world divided into marketing categories for a bit longer, really.
That's another episode.
Yeah. All right, Karl. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys, and
Cheers.
hope the next one is in person. Take care.